Well, this is a story of people, visions, the world of the possible. And it looks at a very short period within Park Service history. The development of the programs for historic architecture within the National Park Service as a national program can be dated to just before the passing of the 1966 Act. At the bookend of my study is the retirement of one of the major small planes in the So this is a limited study looking at the world of the possible. As Ethan mentioned, historic structures were not new to the Park Service. The 1933 reorganization brought a lot of the monuments into the park system. The Historic Sites Act put the National Park Service in the history business. And so when George Herzog became the director in 1964, he came with experience and knowledge of the Park Service. He also was very ambitious, and he was interested to carry out a vision. He saw the potentials for the new park after Mission 66. And he also had an interest in historic preservation. In fact, unbeknownst to most, he was working with then Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, in discussion of what was the possibility of using the Historic Sites Act to expand the scope of the Park Service activities into preservation. And the Secretary and George discovered that the President was interested in working with the National Trust in the bigger movement, so they stepped back. But George was aware of the fact of this transition and his interest in preservation, and in moving from the design offices, the Western Office of Design in San Francisco, the Eastern Office of Design and Construction in Philadelphia, he brought James Massey, the head of the HABS program in Philadelphia, and Henry A. Judd, the head of the Historic Structures program in Philadelphia to Washington. And he created a new branch of historic structures and historic American buildings survey under Charles Lessig, FAIA. And so for the first time, there was a position in the Washington office at the executive level with Charles Lessig reporting to the associate directors and Henry A. Judd as chief of the branch of historic structures, and James Massey reporting to managing the Historic American Building Survey. HALS and HAO didn't exist at that point. I think this is very significant because there was a recognition of a need for overall programs. And so as the evidence of the Preservation Act being enacted and Herzog very actively participating in this program would come to the Department of Interior and the National Park Service, he commissioned a committee to look at new preservation in the parks. And this is an interesting study. Judd and Massey were on that program. Utley Che was on that program. Ronnie Lee, a park regional director and historian, was chair of that program. And it brought together what was this new preservation that was being proposed in Congress and what were the activities to be in the new organization to administer the act. It's interesting that there was a full recognition that the work on historic structures had no programs. There were treatments that were done under Mission 66 and other programs. There was no continuities in the park. It was a very fragmented system where park interpretation, park maintenance, park operations did quite different things, maybe within the same park, regarding historic structures. And so they recommended that there be a focus on historic preservation within the park, particularly architecture, and a recommendation that within the new office there would be 17 historic architects, and the goal would be to develop programs and research and processes to look at these being done by park staff under the experts of exhibit specialists. Exhibit specialists, an interesting classification. The backstory is in my paper. I won't talk about that now. So when the act was passed, it was quite a new activity of taking federal money and working with the states, developing a review process for listing in the National Register, created the whole concept, expanded the concept of the National Register, and a review process under Section 106 of the Code to look at what are the alternatives for preservation. Ernest A. Conley, who had participated in this committee, he was a professor of architectural history at the University of Illinois, and had participated on this planning committee, became director in 1967. OHP, as it was known, had 4 divisions: history, archaeology, National Register, and historic architecture. The first director was chosen by, of that division was Joseph Watterson, FAIA. He was a retired editor of the American Institute of Architects Journal, well known to architects. He was not well versed in bureaucracy. So the major aspect of the historic architecture division was HABs and historic structures. Henry Judd became the chief of the branch, or continued as chief of historic structures under Watterson. The development of the policies of the National Park Service, and this is a major point of accomplishment, occurred during this period, and Henry Judd was involved in that. And the other thing that happened at that point was George Hartzog was aware that the Park Service in the parks was neglecting, abandoning, demolishing historic structures, presumably eligible for listing in the National Register. And he issued a memo saying that all demolition of all buildings over 50 years old had to be approved by him. And then there was sort of a sidebar story in Region Director said, well, we'll destroy them at age 49, which led to another issue. But both the policy, writing, and interpretation as related to historic structures and the review of demolitions for buildings 50 years old became a major part of the activities of the historic structures branch in this early period. The administrative policies really became the framework for how do you hang your hat on this. George Hartzog, when he came into the service, threw out all the manuals. And he says, we are managers, and we can manage by objectives, and we should understand how to make decisions based on basic principles of where we're trying to go. And in writing the administrative policy for historic areas, Robert Utley was selected to chair that. Now, Utley was a published scholar in Western history, long-time regional architect in Santa Fe, knowledgeable about history and historic preservation, and was starting to understand the bureaucracy of Washington. He argued a long time with Hartzog about we have the policies that were written by the advisory board in 1937. And these were policies that really came out of the international thinking of the period. They were written by a lot of people who were involved with Williamsburg and other aspects of preservation in that period of the 30s. Look at Hosmer's work. It's very interesting to realize a lot was going on. And there was a lot of understanding about preservation as the preferred treatment and restoration and reconstruction as the last alternative. Hartzog insisted that the policies be written by professionals within the park programs, not by the advisory board. And after a give and take, there was Utley and a committee, including Hank Judd, prepared the policies. These were compiled in 1968. There were 3 booklets that were organized: a red book for historic areas, areas, a green book for natural areas, a blue book for recreation areas. They were small, 166 pages, small format. They're easy to hold up and say this is what it's about. This became the framework of saying these are the guiding principles for making decisions within the park system. And that continued until 1975 when Gary Everhart became director, and he argued that these all should be combined into one. Utley really went to the mat on that. He had insistence that you had to have history as defined by history. And needless to say, Everhart prevailed, and the Cultural Resource Program became chapter 8 of a huge policy manual that we know today. Also, at the same period, 1971, for a variety of reasons, many of them political, George Hartzell decided to merge the service centers of the Eastern Design Office and the Western Design Office. The Eastern Office had now moved from Philadelphia to Washington, and this was a sudden move. It was such a sudden move that I got a call in the middle of the day from the Chief of Personnel, Larry Zoller, who said, "Hugh, go to see Hank Judd and take that job. He's offered you because something's happening here that you don't want to be any part of." That day they announced that the service centers would be moving to Denver. It was over the Columbus Day weekend in 1971, and anybody would look how sunny could be on the plane on Saturday morning. A lot of people didn't decide to go. There were most of the historic architects working in the service centers were in the field. They were working on projects, where they were representing areas like Fred Gessig in the Caribbean, Penny Batchelor, Lee Nelson, and Independence. So in some regions, opened a position for regional historical architect. It was a convenience of organization. And Robert M. Cox, a design architect in San Francisco, took the position. He had little background and knowledge of historic preservation, but he didn't want to move. The same thing with Vance Kaminsky. Decided going to Omaha was better than going to Denver. And he went to Omaha as a regional director. Dave Battle, a former design architect from the Park Service, was rehired to become the regional architect in Santa Fe, and the Northern Pacific Northwest newly formed region created a position for Lauren Huffman, in spite of the fact that the regional director at that point said, "We have no historic resources here." Which was an interesting point that goes beyond the scope of my discussion. So we had in the regions regional historical architects. We had very little skill in terms of dealing with historic structures in Denver. And that became a point for squabbles between the regional offices and the Denver Service Center that maybe continue today. I joined the Washington office in 1971 after returning from assignments in Jordan and Turkey. So I had an opportunity to have knowledge of international planning and international preservation. Most of the work that we were doing was consulting to the parks. We were talking about the policies. We were talking about the new Executive Order 11593, because this abuse and ignoring and demolition of historic structures was not unique to the Park Service. It was a problem throughout the federal agencies. And Nixon became aware of that, and in May of 71 issued an Executive Order 193 that said federal agencies must look at their historic properties, if eligible, list them in the National Register, and provide stewardship, including the provisions of Section 106. Now, this is a powerful executive order, but like many other things that come out of the White House, often ignored. So one of the tasks of the Advisory Council staff and the Park Service WASO staff was to visit the parks and deal with consultation to how do you deal with the requirements of 110596. So it was interesting working with other agencies to realize that the Forest Service in many ways had more interest in their heritage of their buildings, like treetop fire towers, than the Park Service had in terms of their park headquarters, such as you see from Mount Rainier. There was an interesting dichotomy, though, of interests. I observed that in Prince William Park and Catoctin Mountain Park, both of these were demonstration parks under CCC. The superintendents had intuitively rehabilitated their CCC buildings to be functional, active park buildings using the existing historic buildings. In the same region, the superintendent of the C&O Canal Antietam claimed that there was no authorities under any of this stuff, and buildings were being neglected and abandoned and vandalized. Also at the same time, some regional directors, such as in San Francisco, realized that there were opportunities to list the CCC buildings in the National Register. And this became before the general interest in rustic architecture as a theme today, but certainly recognizing that these buildings were historic. On the other hand, we had the regional director claiming there were no historic resources in the Pacific Northwest. I also had the interesting opportunity to work with Dr. Conley in looking at Chicago theme study, other ways to approach involvement in partnerships. Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation, home for the Vice President, and this involved the Secretary of Interior, Rogers Norton, who was very interested in the parks and their preservation programs. It was interesting. He grew up in a historic house. He had an interest in history. He was really concerned about preservation, even to the point when the battle was going on demolishing the Willard Hotel in Pennsylvania Avenue. He said to Ernest Conley and me, who were representing him on the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation, I want that building saved even if it's a brothel. So that we had the kind of interest from the Secretary. And this was certainly an opportunity to think about what else is possible and what else is needed for the programs. One of the interesting areas that was a total lack of national training in agricultural resource and preservation programs. Many of the historians were generally going to Williamsport for their seminars, but there was no in-house training. And so early in 1968, Henry Judd and Lee Nelson came up with the idea of the William Strickland Center, located in Philadelphia, where civic specialists and architects would work together on projects and learn from each other and develop skills. This idea was sold to Washington. It was funded, and even space was leased. And then at the last minute, the director decided that there was another higher need to get the people at Castle Clinton, New York City office back, and he used that money to fund preservation there. So the idea of the Strickland Center died. It needs some preservation, some research and study, because it was a very interesting concept and it's little known today. But the idea of training didn't die, and Jim Maskins, who was an exhibit specialist working out of Harper's Ferry, and worked with Judd and found some funding, and they proposed a training film on how do you analyze a building. I was involved as technical assistance on that training film episode, and a lot of film was shot, but it was a failure beginning. We didn't really have the whiteboards. We really didn't have the script. It turns out that Jim and his colleagues were master craftsmen, but they were not very good actors. So the idea of the film died, but in that friendship I developed with James Haskins, it really was a high point in my career to be working that closely with a master craftsman and to see the synergies that an architect and craftsman can have when working together. And so we came up with the idea that there needed to be training in the parks for the maintenance staff, that these people had skills, but they did not have focus. They did not understand the problem solving and the implications of fabric. And so in 1973, we had organized the first ever cultural resource training program at the Baptist Training Center, and it was for maintenance workers and a few architects. First class had about 23 people. And we came together for 2 weeks of hands-on and classroom and shop work in terms of what it takes to deal with decision-making in historic parks. And from that discussion came my quote, which is much quoted, not really original, but maintenance is preservation. And that's really the theme of what we have tried to build the programs on. Also, at the same time, I was able to work with the Baptist Training Center to develop a whole catalog of preservation training for superintendents, for managers, working with National Trust for outside, and etc. So the Williamsport Training Center grew out of this program, and that is an adjunct but essential part of working together at the training of craftsmen under Jim Askins. The Williamsport was created as a need recognized by the regional directors and asked Denver Service Center to put together a training program in 1977. The formal training program was started at Williamsport on the canal with Jim Askins, training exhibit specialists and historic architects. And he talked about learning from each other. Well, that's what the Strickland Center was intended to do. So the concept of the Williamsport Training Center lives on, and thanks a lot to Jim Askins. The critical moment came in the reorganization when the idea was to separate out the functions of the Office of Historic Preservation from dealing with the Act and dealing with the parks. And so we had an opportunity to deal with the recreation of his, I don't know what I'm there yet, of the Park Historic Preservation Act. Organization was created to really focus on the program. Utley became the director. There was a division of history, archaeology, and historic architecture. And the decision that every region would have a similar sort of organization. And I think this was a key decision made with the director, that there would be a park historic preservation program within every region. So some regions had historians, some regions had archaeologists, some regions had architectural historical architects, but not all of them were in the same place. There was not a director of the program. So this provided an opportunity for a directed program of historic preservation in the parks from the regional office, mirroring the programs in Washington. So now there's an opportunity to have in all the regions the programs with historical architects, and the new regions in Pacific, in Boston, the North Atlantic region of Blaine Fiver, and in the mountain region of Broadway, really hit the stride because they were new and they were able to make the case for the purposes of archaeology. So Utley was able to really get the attention of Whelan, who was the new director after George Hartsook was fired. We presented a horror show of the neglect and throughout the system, and Walker accepted that. It was a real indictment, and it really pointed to the fact that this neglect was also part of the problem. But the funding needs continued, and the problem was well stated, but the funding needs were not. So there was this moment of park historic preservation programs, and now organized under park operations, and this was somewhat uncomfortable because of the fact that we were working with old rangers. But Jim Tobin, as already been referred to, was really a good ear and provided an opportunity for American things were possible, still a problem. And when Jerry Everhart became director, he had a really negative attitude about preservation. His total reorganization into park operations left Dudley with a position of being downgraded to a division chief. And he leaves in 1976 to look at working with the advisory council. So that is really the bookend, and I want to draw attention to talk about the personalities. I talk about the work with the advisory council. We have the continuity of continuing organization within WASO, within the regions of park historic preservation. The legacy of the park architects. And it's interesting, by the time Hank Judge retired in 1979 and I was selected as the chief historical architect, there were 100 architects, historical architects, working in the park system in Denver, in the parks, in the regions, and many of them here in the room. So it's a legacy that is important to think about, that from almost nothing in 1966, the park historic preservation program that we know today had its basis and its roots. So thank you.